Hello, fellow model railroaders. Welcome to my channel and welcome to the first video in my new Building a Layout series where I will be documenting the building process of my train layout. Here's my layout plan. This is the finalized version of it. It's what I'm going to be building when I'm able to start. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing my experience of planning this layout and walking you through some of the key steps of the process. There are several preliminary steps you have to take before you can even start making the track plan, but the two most important of them is figuring out what space you can use and what your budget will be, because they will dictate what you're able to do with the rest of the layout. For privacy reasons, I'm not going to be disclosing my budget, but I will show you the space I have to build the layout. This is my bedroom. Our house is currently under renovation, so it doesn't look like much. The plan is for this, the north wall, to be where the yard will go. Then it'll come down along here. There'll be a bridge over the egress window. This section is going to be the south wall of the layout. This wall here is going to come down, and that'll free up a lot of space. There'll be a tunnel that goes through here and a shelf with track that goes out along there. But yeah, this is my space for the layout, and that is the plan for it currently. There are several other preliminary things you have to do, and one of them is figuring out what scale you want to do. Now, there are a lot of scales you can choose from, and you have to figure out which one you want to do fairly early on in the process. Some people already have trains that are already invested into a scale, so you might decide to do one scale. For example, I had a lot of traditional O-gauge stuff from when I was a kid, and I figured I might as well build a layout for that stuff. These are actually some of the layout plans that I designed for that, and eventually just decided it's just going to be way too expensive because it's O-gauge. O-gauge is extremely expensive. That's one of the main issues with it. Even traditional O-gauge, unless you're going with like post-war Lionel or Marks or something, it is very expensive. A new O-gauge locomotive will go for at least $400. An O-scale locomotive will go for over $1,000 usually. It wasn't worth it for me considering I wouldn't even be able to do a very large layout. So my point of this is don't be afraid to invest in a different scale if your current scale isn't going to work very well for you. But if you don't currently have any trains, you have a lot of options to choose from. I mean, there's the main scales of G scale, O scale, HO scale, N scales, but then there's also offshoots of those, which is O and 30, HO and 30. My advice is to stick with the main ones, because that's where you're going to get the most support. There's going to be the most manufacturers making stuff. There's going to be a much larger used market for the main scales. The three main ones I'd say you should focus on are O scale, HO scale, and N scale. And as I said before, O scale didn't work for me because it's just too expensive and too big. So I toured around with HO for a bit. I started making a layout plan. I even started like shopping off a track. But HO scale just didn't tick for me. I don't know why. I just didn't really like it. That's not to say HO is a bad scale. It is the most popular train scale in the world for a reason. But I just didn't like it. So what I eventually ended up going with was N scale, because it's half the size of HO. I can do a lot more with N scale than I can do with HO. And it's still a pretty good scale. I'd say it is the smallest you can go without having to make significant compromises, because Z scale is cool, it is tiny. T scale is even more so, but you have to make compromises with them. You don't have as much detail. You have to be much more careful with a lot of stuff with them. N scale is, I think, the smallest you can go currently without having to make significant compromises. So that's why I decided to go with N scale. Another thing you need to do is decide what kind of layout you want, because there are several different kinds of layouts. There's the classic loop, where it's just a loop of track the train runs endlessly on. That's a very common one, and it's been very popular since the very beginning of model railroading back in the very early 20th century. There's the point-to-point layout, which operates like an actual railroad, where there's one like mainline track with branch lines and spurs that go off of it to service various industries, and you run the train to one side of the layout, switch the locomotive to the other side, and pull it back. That sort of layout operates like a short line, but has some limitations, namely that you can't just set the trains running and leave it running. And the last type of layout I'm aware of is a switching layout, where you just switch cars around, and I don't personally see the appeal of that at all, but some people like it, and it is the most space-efficient option, so if that works for you, then it works for you. Personally, though, I want some elements of all of them, and that, I think, is the best combination of layout you can do. But it does depend a lot on personal preference and space. Obviously, a point to point and especially a switching layout is going to take up a lot less space than a large looping layout. Once you have all that stuff figured out, it's time to start the track plan. Now, there are several ways you can do this, and the easiest is to use a track planning software like AnyRail or SCARM. Some people use a pencil and paper method where they individually measure and draw out every track piece to do it, and that works just fine. It's actually maybe a little bit more accurate than track planning software if you do it right, but it's very time consuming and it's easy to mess up. But if that's your thing, you can go ahead and do it. And some people, they just already have the track, so they'll just lay out the track for the track plan. But personally, I'd recommend using a track planning software. And the one that I use is SCARM. I know AnyRail is an option. Lots of people like AnyRail. I have heard some people say that SCARM is basically a copy of AnyRail. But anyway, SCARM has a free option, which allows you to place 100 items in the track plan. And so long as you're not doing a massive layout, the free version of SCARM should be just fine. My layout was a little bit too large for that though, so I did have to buy the license key. But here's my layout plan. Obviously, it's going to be a shelf type layout that'll hug the perimeter of the room. So let's just jump straight into it and talk about the yard. The roundhouse and turntable are the oldest parts of the yard. They're the only parts that are original to the yard, and they are kind of going to be the centerpiece of the yard, even though they're way on the right side of it. Over here, there's going to be a diesel shop, and then coming off the turntable, I'm going to have a track to go straight through, and then there'll be a siding, which will have the refueling station, so the coal tower, water tower, a diesel filling station, sand tower, and then this track here is just going to be storage. These 4 tracks here are classification tracks. So those are the tracks that are going to be used to move around and sort the trains. This green track here, that is where the trains are going to be assembled and disassembled when they arrive and leave the yard. And this track is about 6 feet long, so it will be able to fit a pretty respectable sized train. Over here, the yellow track is the yard lead, so that's where the switcher will pull all the cars out and then move them back in. This orange loop here is going to be the reverse loop. This is going to be a real pain to wire, but I feel like I need to have a reverse loop so I can move the locomotives from one side to the other, like a runaround track. And then this part of the yard over here is not going to be part of the original layout. It's going to come later after I've got the rest of the track work done. And that's mainly for budget reasons, but also I don't want to overwhelm myself by having too much track to do. Then as we're coming down here, you can see that bridge I was talking about over the egress window. This should be a big enough gap that if I need to get out in the case of a fire or an emergency, I should be able to. And then down here is the town part of the layout. This is going to be themed after a typical small town you'd see in the American Midwest. There will be a junkyard here that has some spur tracks. I plan to put like an old locomotive that is in the process of being scrapped here. And then obviously there's this elevator because a staple of Midwestern towns is having grain elevators. And then over here is just going to be town detail. There's not going to be anything to do with the railroad there. It's just going to be towns. Out here, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I've toyed around with having a winter scene, but I've also thought I might be able to add another industry, like maybe a coal mine or something along those lines, because I'd like to have coal trains on my layout. But anyway, that's the layout plan. This layout is going to be a huge undertaking, so it's probably going to take a long time to build, but it should be worth it in the end.